Hello, everyone. So let's talk today about the next step in the analysis process and the cycle of analysis that we've been discussing for several weeks. So once you have your findings and you have some robust coding done, you have some robust themes identified, and you have some theorizing that you want to present, you need to think about how you're going to communicate these findings. How do we present findings in qualitative research? That's going to be the focus of today, and also thinking about how you're going to do this for your piece of research and your final assignment. So we've seen in our readings for the last several weeks some really nice examples of how to present data. In particular, we've seen data tables where we have the theme or the code that's presented. We have a short description of that code. It might be a few words that describe it. It might be a short sentence that's actually a definition or some kind of extrapolation of what it means, what the name of the code means. And then we have exemplary quotes that are directly from the data, directly from participants, word for word from your transcription that illustrate the quote or speak to the quote, or that have been coded or speak to the code. So these quotes have been coded for the particular thing that you're now describing. So this is very common in qualitative data, and you would see some good examples in the papers that are provided. You can also see examples in other papers if you do research on your own to explore qualitative reporting. And this is really kind of really expected in a qualitative research report, especially linking the quotes to the codes and or themes. It's really important that you show in your data where this is coming from. You also have seen some examples of code trees, in particular the ones I've shared from our work in the Making with Place project. And this is also commonly done to show the architecture of the way that you're grouping the information that you're coding and thematizing. So you might want to think about how you could use these approaches to show more of a graphical depiction of the process of thought that is developing. And I used a software called Miro, Miro, to develop these code trees. It does have a free option, and it is something that can be useful. Not expected, but useful if you feel this is an interesting way to show your data. The other thing we've seen is examples of models. This is a model from the Inuit food insecurity article from a few weeks ago by Beaumier and Ford. And this is another way that you can show the relationship between the ideas that you're developing. So you might have a table that outlines the quotes and the key themes or codes, and then you may have a graphic that shows how they relate together in a kind of process-oriented way. And this is going towards more expressing your theory. So these are different ways that you can show the evolution of the development of your analysis and your interpretation. Also becoming more and more popular are word clouds. There are softwares such as Wordle that can create interesting diagrams that capture the number of words that are coming out in your analysis. So it might be, and you did an example of this in one of your tutorials, where you generated words, and the words, if there's more people talking about the words, then they get bigger in the word cloud. And so you can see, and this is an example of a piece of research done on people describing their favorite teacher in one word, and things like inspiring, compassionate, caring, those are larger because more people said those things. So you can use that to denote the codes that you're using and the relative importance in the data in terms of how many times they came up. You can also use something called a concept map, which is like a diagram, but it relates things to each other in a kind of a more conceptual way. And this is a way of making a kind of map that shows the linkages between things. This is a concept map around the idea of colonization. So after contact, stolen land, influences of Christianity, influences of drugs and alcohol that arrived, led to reserve systems, led to residential schools, and led to economic exclusion, social exclusion, violence, loss of language and culture that then leads to the kinds of outcomes that we see today, unfortunately, in some of the processes of colonization. So this is an example of a concept map, and this might be something that comes out of your analysis. Not every analysis lends themselves to a concept map, but some very much do. So these are also ways that we present ideas and themes coming out of qualitative research. And another example is the idea of infographics, and you see this being used a lot more. So this is kind of when you're really synthesizing your data. And increasingly, what we're seeing people want to communicate data in a way that they call data visualization. So this is less about the raw data and more about the final findings that come out. This is a piece of research done on the experience of tax credits and what they do. They improve mental health. They improve infant and maternal health, they lead to better school performance, et cetera, you can see here in this infographic. So this is a way of presenting the overall findings of research that is interesting and engaging. But when we're developing these things, what are the main principles that we want to think about? So it's not enough just to create tables and diagrams. We have to describe them, and we have to locate them in our contextual analysis. And how do we do that? What are the key things that help us do that? Well, you have a couple of really great readings this week that unpack the idea of how we think about presenting and communicating our findings in qualitative research. And one key idea is this concept of openness. The Chanel reading talks about some really important things. And so, just as we've been reflexive through the process of doing our research, we want to be reflexive in the way that we communicate the research, the findings of the research. And while doing that, we have to communicate how we found those findings. So Chanel talks about presenting the story of the findings. What are the findings tell us? And we often think of presenting qualitative research on a continuum really around storytelling, but going to the data to ensure that we're telling the story that the data tells us. But we want to present that story, but we also want to present the method of how we constructed that story. So because it's very important to locate our work, because we're talking about subjective conclusions that are very contextually based, we need to talk about how we came to those conclusions so that people can evaluate whether they trust those conclusions and whether we have really been thorough in the way that we've constructed our analysis. So, things you can do is talk about how the project came to be, how we created the projects, and what were the choices we made along the way. Why did we code certain things as the key codes? Why did we group them into themes? Again, this is why you're using quotes to illustrate what you're coming up with, because you're going back to the data and saying, here's in the data where I found this. And what did you do at every point along the way? Really, this doesn't have to be super minutiae detail, but you want to give a big picture of how you came about constructing this story. And of course, it always comes back to the data, and this comes up over and over again. You don't want to go beyond the data. You're using the data to tell this story. So yes, you're telling a story, but you're not telling a story that you're making up. You're telling a story that's coming from the data in all its richness, breadth, and depth. So this is a way you can use tables and diagrams to capture the depth and richness of the data and then describe it. And so this is the process of doing this is what Chanel calls juxtaposition. So you're juxtaposing the quotes, or if you're using images, or if you're using field notes from participant observation, you're juxtaposing that data with analysis of the data. So you don't just put the quote out there, you also describe what the quote and the code mean in textual way, so in a writing way, in paragraphs. And you'll see this if you go back to your readings, you'll see this in the different qualitative studies that we've provided you as examples, such as the Inuit Food Insecurity Study, or the study about the land-based explorations in Labrador, and other studies as well that have been provided that show you how the authors present the data, but then also write in a narrative format using paragraphs and an essay format to talk about the data. So you can't just put the quotes and expect the quotes to speak for themselves. You need to juxtapose the data with your explanations and analyses of the data. And you need to contextualize. And this is also where you can describe the process by which you came to these conclusions. And Chanel refers to this as the Tarzan process. So Chanel says that after I have selected my data exemplars, in particular the quotes from a transcript, which is what you'll be doing, I arrange them in the word processing file, and then I go from each, adding my comments. So this is where you write sentences that describe both the quotes and the themes that came out of them, and also how you found them or why you put those things together. And so you can cut and paste your key quotes, and then you can build your paragraphs around them. That's the Tarzan process. So the quotes become the vines, and then you swing from vine to vine as you're writing up your analysis. And we'll try to do an example of this on our next Zoom call to kind of illustrate how you might use this this process to go about writing up a paper that describes your findings. And so, in general, how do we think about going about writing about those findings? Well, again, Chanel tells us some ways that we might think about how we might present this data, and how we might actually tell a story using this data. So you might do it in what Chanel calls a natural way. So this might that resembles the phenomenon being studied, I believe. Chanel used the idea of, if you're studying a therapy session, then that has a timeline to it. It has a start, a middle, and an end that is very specific to the process of the session. So it naturally, you probably would present that story from start to middle to end. So if there's a timeline involved, then it might be sort of a process related to the natural process, the natural way it unfolded. You also, if you're developing a number of different themes, and they don't really have necessarily a timeline, or you're not so stuck with a timeline, then you might sort of talk about the most simple things that you discovered, and then talk about the most complex. So you move from more simple ideas to more complex ideas. That's one way of telling a story. You could talk about the first thing you discovered, and then move to to the last, move through your discovery process to the things you discovered next, and then to the last things that you discovered. This is a bit more of a timeline, but you're synthesizing rather than just telling the story of how something happened naturally in time. You're talking about, I discovered this when I first started looking at the data, and then as I started to look more deeply, I discovered more additional things. So this might be similar to the simple to complex, but it's slightly different because it's really about how your analysis unfolded. You can also do a quantity-informed analysis. You might say the most number of times I encountered this. So you might say the most dominant theme, because it happened in 60% of the transcripts, is this theme, is X theme, and you might present, and the second most dominant that happened in 30% of the transcripts is Y theme. So you might actually go with the number of times you see a particular code or theme and present it that way. And you can also be theory guided. So if you have a particular theory, it could be something like intersectionality, it could be an indigenous way of knowing, it could be Marxism. You can actually present your results in relation to that theory. So if there's key tenets of that theory, then you can also use those tenets to build your presentation of your analysis and say, these different codes and themes spoke to this particular part of the theory that I'm trying to explore using this research. And you can also do a kind of narrative logic. So this is the most storytelling approach. This is where you have maybe a key character or a key protagonist or a key idea that's coming out of the data, and you use a narrative style to describe that idea. So this is really kind of like where you have a beginning, middle, of end of a story. You can go from most important to least important, or from major to minor. So you maybe want to start, and often we see this, especially when we're doing presentations, or maybe there's a group of stakeholders and we've brought them together to tell them about something that we've just analyzed, and we want them to remember some key things that are really key and really important, and that maybe have the most importance for taking this data forward, what we're going to do with these conclusions. And so we want to start off with those to make sure everybody really gets a sense of what the most important things are. Or you can do it in the more dramatic presentation style, as Chanel refers to it, which you start off with some of the sort of basic findings, and then you leave the most surprising discovery things for last, and this kind of ends with a bang in terms of the way you're telling your story. or you can have no particular order. And sometimes when you read studies, you might say to yourself, I don't really know what order these people have presented this in. There's no actual conscious pattern. So you don't have to choose a pattern, but I would suggest, especially for the first times that you're doing this kind of analysis and presentation, you might want to choose a pattern, especially if you see one coming out. If you see, often when we're discovering the data and we're discovering the analysis that we want to put forward, we can see that there's a certain kind of story that's coming out from our own experience of the data. And so that might be a very good way to tell the story to other people. So yeah, you can use any of these patterns, or you can choose to just present the data however, just however it kind of unfolds. But again, how do we think about, constructing something that is compelling, constructing this narrative in a way that you want to read it, that you want to tell it, and people want to read it or listen to it? So you have an interesting TED Talk talking about data storytelling, how data storytelling is very similar to broader concepts of storytelling. And you might have favorite stories that you love for different reasons, and the TED Talk gets into that, but really highlights this idea that being able to tell a good story is really having a focused understanding of the problem you are trying to solve. So again, this goes back to really defining what you're looking at in this broader data set, because you can be looking at lots of different things and you're going to hone in onto something specific. And why are you going to hone in on that, and how are you going to keep coming back to that? That's the way you do good analysis. It's also the way you tell a good story. So you want to maybe determine the central plot line, and that can go to some of the strategies I just spoke to that are in the Chanel reading, or just really sort of a brainstorming of, how are all of these themes coming together to create a theory. In fact, your main theories, your main 1 or 2 or 3 theories, are really your plot lines. So focus on those and tell us how they answer the question that you've brought up or that you've started with. Again, you need to use data to exemplify, illustrate, and illuminate this story. Go back to the data. If you're telling this story and you have only 1 or 2 quotes in there, or none at all, then you're not really telling the story from the data. So you really need to build the data in. That's where the Tarzan process can be really useful. You start with the data and then you build the story around it. And also the idea of emphasizing context. We've used this word all the time in qualitative research. What is the scene? What is the place that this is taking place in? The time and the place, the broader socio-political environment often is very important for our analysis, and the characters, the people that we're speaking to, and the things that they're telling us. And so taking point of view very seriously, this is where, we're using anonymity to protect the confidentiality of our participants, but we're also locating who said what. So we're using pseudonyms, or we're using initials, but we're showing which person said what, so that we can notice in our analysis where similar things are being said by the same person, or where they're developing their own theorizing by speaking. You're going to have one person in your interviews, so it's not going to be as complex for you as some analyses. But the point of view of that person and the voice of that person should also be what you're going back to when you're thinking about grounding this in the data. And taking metaphors seriously. Metaphors can be really important. They're super important for storytelling, of course, and they can really be important for understanding the depth and the nuance of our analysis and of our data and the stories and the things, the conclusions and the ideas that are coming forward. And I shared an example of a metaphor in the work of our Making of Place project, where we talked about place as an internal landscape, and this image of intrusive thoughts that was drawn by one of our participants. So the dandelions represent sometimes the thoughts that come into our minds. And this participant described how during isolation, they felt that there was a lot of that going on, because you're kind of stuck with yourself. You're becoming acquainted with yourself in this time of little distraction and little ability to engage with other people. And so this is the image of the dandelion as this internal landscape, and the brain representing sort of the mind in the internal landscape, and the dandelion representing these thoughts that come unbidden into our brains in times of isolation. And so this is an idea of a metaphor that we're actually working very actively with in our analysis, because we think this tells us a lot about individual experiences of creating in the time of pandemic, but also broader social experiences that can help us with our theorizing. So this is just an example to share about this idea of how metaphor can really lead us forward in our analysis, and can be interesting, very interesting to people listening to the story of our analysis. But again, the stories we're telling have to be rigorous. They have to be trustworthy. If someone asks you, why did you say this or that? Why are you telling this particular story, or you're communicating this particular idea about the phenomenon you're investigating? You're able to give a reasonable explanation. And reasonable doesn't mean it sounds good. Reasonable means, I mean, that's part of it. But reasonable, what it means is that you can defend it, that you have, again, you have the data to back it up, you have the processes to back it up, you've linked it to potentially to literature or other kind of theory if that's useful for your analysis. You have an explanation for where this is coming from. And so how do we ensure that we're doing that well? What are some of the strategies or criteria that people might look at? So these don't apply to every situation, but these are common ways that we evaluate qualitative research and to see whether we feel that it's rigorous. So one of the key things is this idea of prolonged engagement. So you're spending time in the setting. And even for your interview, that was a somewhat prolonged engagement. You didn't talk to the person for 10 minutes. You spent, hopefully the better part of an hour with this person, and you tried to engage in depthly. You used probes. You wanted to go. You wanted to really deeply engage. And in some settings, we spend months doing qualitative research. And the project I've been telling you about with Making with Place is almost a year old at this point. So there usually is quite a lot of engagement that is quite prolonged in qualitative research work, and that allows us to better understand and defend what we're seeing. We also have this idea of participant checks, where we get feedback from participants. So we create our analyses, and then we show them to the people upon whom we've been engaging in research, or hopefully with whom we've been engaging collaboratively in research. And then we work together on better defining what we're seeing in the data. So this might be as simple as showing your report to the persons that you've engaged with in the research and saying, did I get this right? Is there anything in here that just doesn't sit well with you, or that just seems wrong? Or it might be that you engage them at the level of coding, that you show them your initial codes, and then you develop the themes and theories together. Or they do the coding of some of the transcripts. That is, as you've seen from the Depict model, that's a model that has been used, that Flicker and Nixon used, where they actually had participants who were the data subjects be part of the data analysis. So there's different ways to do participant checks, but the key idea is that you're getting feedback from the people that you're working with in the research about the things that you're coming up with, and they're able to comment on the findings. Journaling is also a key way to be rigorous. It's a key way we think about reflexivity, where we're writing down our assumptions, our perspectives, the challenges, the highlights that are coming out for us in this work. And we're doing this as we're doing the process of collecting the data, and then as we're doing the process of analyzing the data. And this also is where we can go back to answering that question, where does this come from? We can go back to our journal notes and say, well, I was reflecting on this and that, and this is how I came to this idea. This came up a little bit in our Zoom discussion last week as well, is how do we know we're not making judgments in the data, we're actually interpreting the data, or that we're grounding the work in the data rather than just making unfounded conclusions or judgments. Well, if we journal a lot and we think about the complexities of what we're trying to come up with, then maybe those things can kind of become a little bit more clearer. Somebody talked about how, when we were watching the activism video, a person spoke about their relative privilege, and we can maybe infer where that privilege might come from, but we don't know for sure what that person is speaking about, in particular in relation to their location. And so that was a way of sort of checking one's assumptions through a reflective, which could come out of a process like journaling. that allows us to build a stronger and better defended analysis, or a more grounded analysis. Another way we can do this is through peer review. In that example I just shared about the Zoom call and the activism video, is maybe an example of peer review, where a person's thinking something and they put it out to a group and the group has a critical discussion about it, or maybe it's a one-on-one discussion. So peer review is where a person who has some skills in this area, maybe has done qualitative research, is a colleague or a friend that you trust, you can critically discuss the ideas you're having with them, to check them, to develop them, and really to articulate them, and sort of get into a process of critical analysis with this person, where they can help you deepen your reflections, to really ensure that you are defending your analysis. And again, this idea of an audit trail, where you're really documenting the decisions and choices that you're making. So this is like journaling, this is like the peer review, but this is where you're kind of really describing this in a succinct format. So you may have pages and pages of journals, and then when you come down to the audit trail, you describe in a paragraph or two, the key decisions that you made and why. And this might be how you moved from codes to themes, how you moved from themes to broader theories, and why you felt that it was a justification for the kinds of conclusions and choices you were making. And so really it all comes down to, again, this idea of being reflexive. So there's a really nice quote here in the Mayan reading, to embrace how I am in my research, how I construct my research, how I generate or make data, and how I represent and write. Really embracing your experience with this and the things that happened for you that you then want to communicate outwardly, that is coming out of what you're seeing in this piece of research. And to ensure that the images and stories help explain, and often in the context of a particular literature. So you're going to be asked in your final assignment to locate your work in one or two pieces of literature, and that's really important way to also go back to contextualizing the things that you're seeing and providing sense that this analysis can be trusted, that it is that has truth to it. We know that we think that there are multiple truths, and that we've been really constructing over this entire semester. The idea of truth is not one thing only or one kind of truth, but there are multiple ways of seeing and knowing. But we also want it to be trustworthy, that the way that we're putting forward the perspective that we're sharing has rigor to it, that it has some trueness. It reflects something true. And so for your final paper, you're going to be putting together this entire analysis and communicating it back, presenting it back. And now this paper is due on April 12th. As we've discussed a few times, you can do it individually, or I should have changed the slide actually. You can do it in groups of up to 4. We do suggest you keep it to 3 or less. We find that once you get into 4, it becomes harder to do a collaborative analysis, because it's just that much more complicated to organize across multiple people. But you can do it in up to 4 if that's a key importance for you, especially at this time where we're all working remotely. You're going to have to coordinate across multiple schedules in a particular way. So think about that. Hopefully you've already developed, if you're working in groups, hopefully you've already identified your partners and you're well on your way to defining your research question and getting your data set put together so you can start to code your transcripts. So you need to create a research question, as we've discussed a few times already. Get some sample, develop a sample from the transcript database, which we've also provided multiple times. I've discussed the database and provided you the links. They are on the e-class, very clear to find under the final assignment details. So you're going to be creating a research question, pulling out transcripts from our transcript database that you feel will answer that question or speak to that question, identifying 10 to 20 of those transcripts and then coding those transcripts for your question. You can use our class coding framework as a guideline, and then you can also hone in on your own coding framework as you're really developing the answers to your question. And then, as I've just presented here, you can create tables, diagrams, and stories to describe the things that are coming out for you, the conclusions, the findings, the codes and themes that are emerging from this coding and this analysis that you're undertaking. And then you'll write about that. So you'll have a method section that is your tables and your diagrams, hopefully with some key quotes and some actual, some actual pieces of data, which really are pieces of the transcripts, the quotes that you're using. And then you have a section where you're discussing those, where you're writing in paragraph format, describing the analysis and the findings. And then a very final section where you're communicating key theories and conclusions about the work that you've just engaged in that goes back to answering your research question. And so, yes, you should. This is also on eClass. I talked about it briefly already in one of my lectures, but here it is again. The criteria for how you write this paper. It is a 10-page paper, double-spaced. The first page should be an introduction. And in this introduction, you should describe your research question, and you should also describe how this is located in current literature. So to do really well in this assignment, certainly to achieve an A level, you want to locate your research question in at least 2 to 4 outside sources. This is where you're doing your own research, to locate people who have already written about the particular question that you have, so that you can locate your research question in a body of literature, or at least in a few literature sources. So if you're talking about newcomer students and their experiences of activism, then you might do a search in a scholarly database to identify anyone who's written anything about newcomer experiences and activism. Or maybe if you can't find activism, you find about newcomer experiences in education, or newcomer experiences in environmental studies. If you're writing about something about like intersectionality, well, we know there's a lot of literature on that. So you might want to try to find some literature specific to students' experiences in intersectionality. So you can be broad in the way that you locate your research question. You don't have to find studies that speak directly to your entire research question. The reason you're asking that question is because you think there might be some new ideas in our data set to answer that question, but you want to locate in some sources that speak to the question or that tell us something about what we already know about some aspects of that question. Then you're going to create a methods section, which should be about 2 to 3 pages long. And this is where you talk about how you went through your analysis, how you engaged in the analysis, if you did a participatory analysis where you worked in a group and you went across multiple transcripts together. Maybe you coded separate transcripts and you came back together. Maybe you coded some of the same transcripts to see whether you were getting similar ideas coming out. If you used any of the process from the Depict article, you can refer to that in your methods section. If you're doing it alone, that's fine, but locate this also. How did you do your analysis yourself? How did you come up with the answers or the codes and the key themes that you came up with? And also tables and diagrams that show these, that show your codes and your categories, and also show the key quotes that you used to develop these. And this, again, should be referred to the course readings. You have many course readings on the process of doing qualitative research. So you have lots that you can use to say, I used this particular principle from this particular reading to develop my codes and themes and categories. Or categories. You can describe them as codes, themes, or categories, however you want to use those terminologies. Just be consistent with your terminology and make sure, when you're talking about codes, then they're more the less synthesized data, and then categories are when you're starting to put things together and become more more complex. You're putting multiple ideas together. So, just be consistent with the way you're using the terminology, and make sure that when you're talking about moving from codes to categories, you're talking about assembling ideas together. You're having some basic ideas, which are the codes that come out of the data, and then you're putting those together to create categories. So just make sure that you're using logic when you're using the terminology, and that you're consistent with the terminology. And then you'll have a results page, which is going to be the bulk of your analysis. This is where that's about 5 pages long, where you really discuss your key findings. And this is where you can use the Tarzan method, where you talk about the key quotes that are in your tables. So you might not describe every single quote in your table, but you might describe some of the very important ones. You might list them right in your results section, and then describe how they inform your analysis and how they speak to the particular category that you have provided. What are really kind of coming out of your findings. So this is this is where you're really describing the story. This is the storytelling section in particular of your analysis. And then the very final page or 2 pages, this is where you can speak directly to the final things, or the key findings, the conclusions, the major theories that are coming out of your work. And this is where you should also go back to the literature that is cited in your introduction. So you asked a question in your introduction, you elaborated throughout the rest of the paper a method of answering that question, and then the results that came out in answer to that question. And then at the very end, you want to go back to the question and then go back to what you had already proposed are key pieces of literature that speak to that question, that talk about what we already know, and then say, how does my findings speak to what we already know? How does it build on, how does my analysis build on the current state of literature to maybe confirm something, to maybe contrast something, or question something that we already had in the knowledge base, or to provide a new perspective on that knowledge base, to deepen the perspective of that knowledge base. And the other thing you need to do for this is a tutorial presentation. So big heads up that this is coming up very soon, less than 2 weeks away, on March 22nd and 23rd. In your tutorials, you need to do a presentation to describe where your analysis is at. You don't have to be completed your analysis. Obviously, you have a few weeks after these presentations to get the final paper completed, and you'll probably be most very likely in the weeds of your analysis, as we say sometimes at this point in your analysis, but you should be able to communicate most of what you've done for the first 4 steps of the analysis. So this is a 5-minute presentation. If you're working alone, then it's a 5 minutes for yourself to present. If you're working in a group, then it's 1 5-minute slot per group. If you are in separate tutorials, then each person will present. So if there's 2 people working together, but they're not in the same tutorial, then each one of those people will present in their tutorial. If there's 3 people and 2 of them are in the same tutorial and 1 is not, then there'll be 1 presentation for the 2 people and then another presentation for the 1 person who's not in that group. So each tutorial will get a presentation from the person or group, and that's 5 minutes long. And in that presentation, you should discuss the steps 1 to 4 of the analysis. So you should discuss the research question that you came up with. You should discuss how you developed a sample from our database, how you identified the transcripts that you coded, and then you should talk about how you coded them and what some of the key codes that are coming out. So you might not be completed your entire coding, you might not have all of your categories identified yet, but you can talk about what is coming out of the data and some of the key things that you're finding. And perhaps if there's time in the tutorial presentations, you may get some feedback from your peers about the process. You may even have some questions that you want to bring to the group, because as you're working through your analysis, of course, lots of questions and ideas are going to come up. So that's a 5-minute presentation. It is not our next class session, but the one after that, so it's coming up very soon. And then you also will need to provide a summary, a 1-page summary to your TA on the day of your presentation that gives them a summary of what you're covering in your presentation. And so that's where we're at for this session today. And on the next Zoom session, our Zoom lecture session, our large class session, we will get a chance to talk a little bit. Perhaps we'll try to model the Tarzan method to talk a little bit more in a collaborative discussion about how we do write up these kinds of analyses. If you have any questions, please bring them to that session, because that will deepen the understanding for everybody. And then in your next tutorial sessions, you'll be preparing for the tutorial presentation. So your TA will go over all of the presentation details and talk in depth about how to support you for the presentation. So that will be the following week. Okay, look forward to chatting with everybody next Monday in our Zoom session.